This is Matt Brown, and you're listening to Just a Good Conversation. I wish Dr. Mike Spagna would have been my teacher when I was told I had dyslexia. You would have thought I had weeks to live the way they told my mother about this thing I had. So I worked harder with the help of my friends and family and some of the teachers that understood what it was. When I heard Dr. Spagna talk about dyslexia when I started at Dominguez, I knew I had to have him on the podcast.
Invariably, when I would interview these young adults, they would say, yeah, I was identified for a gifted program in elementary school, in math, in art, in science, in English. And then what happens, I call it a halo effect. All of a sudden, they hear that they're gifted in an area. Their parents hear that. And so think about this. The halo effect is, well, you're gifted in this, you're gifted in everything. So what's completely incompatible with that is, you're gifted in math, why can't you read? You're gifted in math, why can't you write? You're gifted in math, why can't you spell?
I'm Matt Brown, host of Just a Good Conversation. Take a listen to our archives. My guests have ranged from book authors, professional baseball players, college professors, and former D1 softball player, now working in a sports ministry, Gabby Rodellis.
Also, I think the major drive to choose softball was just that relationship with my dad. I just saw how much being in softball, we would always, even in high school or when we first started, we would be out there, me and him, just hitting me balls, like always getting better. And I just, not only did I love to get better, but I just loved the attention that I got with my dad. And we spent, those are some of the most sweet moments that I got to experience with him.
The rest of my conversation with Gabby can be found on our archives at justagoodconversation.com. Let's take a quick break for a sponsor before diving into my conversation with Dr. Michael Spagna. Maine Farmhouse Brands was started by Dan McCool, a healthcare professional. His goal was to make premium soap. Most people may not realize how important the right soap is for their health and the difference between soap and detergent. Soap is made from natural ingredients like animal and plant fats, whereas detergent is made from synthetic, often harsh chemicals, even fossil fuels like petroleum. Maine Farmhouse Brands makes their own soap with natural ingredients, free from harsh chemicals. So if you want to keep your skin healthy and clean, I would recommend using Maine Farmhouse Brand soap instead of detergent. You can find their body wash, shave soaps, laundry soap, and beard oils, and more at mainfarmhousebrands.com. I will have been in this job for 2 years, May. And I don't know, Mike, when I first heard you say something about dyslexia, but when you did, I was like, I got to have you on. And I'm glad I've got you today.
Oh, thank you.
It's not a dirty secret, but it's something people don't talk about, their learning disorders.
Right.
So when you were discussing dyslexia, I think it was an event. It wasn't International Students Day, but it was something with the teachers, and you were talking about it, and I was like, that's a guy I wish I had in my early youth. Because what you studied was not happening in the 70s.
So the initial response I give to you is, unfortunately, it's not happening to the level it needs to in 2024. So I appreciate you talking about that in the 70s. And I think throughout my career, I've worked with families, I've worked with teachers, I've worked with students. And I wish I could give you the good news, which is in 2024, we've been able to scale that summit, that we actually provide the kind of supports to kids and to their families and awareness and teaching advocacy. We still have so far to go on that front. And daily I encounter stories of former teachers, former faculty that I prepared, who talk about their challenges of how do I get this? How do I get to this place? And at the end of the day, I'll share with you that the number one challenge is, people often ask me, like, what's the top learning disability? What's the top learning problem? And I'll say, well, the top one from my standpoint is dyspedagogia, bad teaching. You know, and I can't blame that on teachers, and in no way do I say that to offend them. It's the most noble profession out there. But we don't give the kind of supports to teachers that they need to really be able to work with all learners. And so we still are stuck in this place where it's more about diagnosing and labeling than it is about what can I do without using a label. So that'll be a theme, I think, that we can talk through during today.
Do you come from a house full of teachers, mom and dad?
Yes and no. Interestingly enough, my father was, of all things, a heart surgeon. So he was a cardiothoracic surgeon, but, and we can talk more about that if you're interested. It kind of led me down a path of having more of a medical kind of ideation, a background. I was exposed to it as a young kid. I saw the first open heart surgery that my father performed at around the age of 11. So that makes an indelible mark on you.
Wow.
I kind of grew up around medicine and biology. My mother is a registered nurse. I have a sister who's a registered nurse. My mother's father was also a surgeon. So we have like a medical background. And one of the things that I took away from that experience was a do no harm. And that came into my notions of teaching, and I still think we have a long way to go there. I will say, though, that an interesting part of your question about, do I come from a background of teachers? Although my father was a heart surgeon, he was also first and foremost a teacher. He had worked at University of Pennsylvania, he had worked at Temple University, and he was very proud of his teaching. He would prepare future surgeons for passing their boards, being successful. And I remember when he passed away, and he passed away at a fairly young age, I remember going through his briefcase and finding all of the scores of the students he had prepared, and they all had 100% on their boards. So it was a pride point for him. So it was not only the practice of medicine, but it was also paying it forward. It was teaching future professionals about how to become good surgeons. So there's a teaching aspect that eventually bloomed when I started college, as I took a path originally in medicine, but then did a divergence into a different part of my career.
Was that at Northwestern?
It was at Northwestern. So graduating from a small public high school in a suburb of Philadelphia, Springfield High School, and then going to Northwestern. I grew up in Philadelphia. We have a couple generations that grew up in Philadelphia. I didn't want to stay in the city or around the city, but I wanted a different experience. So I chose Northwestern in Chicago because I really wanted to get to know another part of the country. And I'll tell you, it made all the difference. It was in Chicago, different kind of experience. And it turned out that Northwestern University at the time was really good for pre-med students. It was very strong in the sciences. But what I didn't know coming in is they also had a world-class program in communicative disorders. And I didn't discover that until I was at Northwestern for about a semester and then took a survey course. And in this survey course, part of your undergraduate experience, I got exposed to 3 fields that just changed my life. And it was speech and language therapy. At the time it was called pathology, audiology, and then the field of learning disabilities. And learning disabilities, although I'd heard about it, I didn't really understand it from a clinical aspect. But I get into the survey class, and part of the survey class was not only learning about these different areas of communicative disorders, but it also had a very intense clinical component. So when you were there as undergraduate students, you're working with young students and families. So this was pretty critical. And I'll tell you, it led me down a certain path, which was very interesting. Again, growing up in a medical family, having this experience. And there's one really poignant experience that I share from time to time, and I'll share with you. During this time in I think it was maybe my sophomore year in college. Look, I'm 19 years old, and I hear weeping up on the second floor of the clinic. And I'm going up, getting ready for class, and I see a person sitting up in one of the lounge chairs, and she just is bent over with just sobbing into her hands. And I came up, and I said, can I help you? Is there something wrong? Can I get you anything? And she looked at me with tears in her eyes. This was so indelible in my experience. And she said, they told me my child's retarded. And I heard this, and it hit something in my soul. And to be honest with you, what it hit in my soul was, number one, this person was in extreme distress, extreme pain, and there was nothing she could do about it. Yeah. She was weeping silently. No one was coming up to her. No one was asking her if she was okay. And that set me on a path that eventually, it took me to even my career now as a provost in a Cal State University school, where for me, there was something that fundamentally stuck out for me of that's not right. You don't give somebody a label. You don't collapse the totality of a child into a name. And this woman was weeping over, what do I do next? What does this represent? Right. There were shades of shame. There were shades of, I can't talk to anybody. I'm going to have to suffer in silence. There were shades of, what do I do in the future? How am I going to support my child. So I never forgot that lesson, and it actually set me on a path for the rest of my career as I learned and got involved in education of rejecting on the front end ever using labeling as a way of identifying students. Right. And so that's a topic, again, we can talk more about, but it eventually led me into both teaching and to preparing teachers. And one thing I always tried to ask teachers to avoid was start with labels. Don't start with diagnoses. It cuts off your ability to see kids holistically. Right. And it's, by the way, one of the reasons why kids still today in 2024 have negative outcomes, because we tend to collapse them into a thing. We do the otherism, and we don't see them for holistic, wonderful human beings. And we still have a long way to go on that front. And it's not teachers try and make a difference, parents try and make a difference, but society still sees individuals that way.
Yeah, it's, it's almost, let's just put them in a box, done. Mm-hmm. Just label, box, finish, shuffle them off. I mean, my mom went through that experience. That was my experience with dyslexia. I was at a Montessori school. They called her up and said, we can't deal with this kid anymore. Yep. Can you just pick him up on Friday and take him home? They didn't know what to do.
Well, I want to build on that, because another thing that I often encountered as well was every student has an island of competence. I don't, and this is from a colleague of mine that was at Harvard University, and we worked together for many years. And I subscribe to that. Every student has areas of strength. Every student has areas of affinity. Every student has an island of competence. The challenge we have, and it's still in 2024, the reason why it hurts my heart, because many kids, when they go through the system, will say, I survived school. And when they say I survived school, again, we are not adjusting and reaching out to students with warm hugs intellectually to kind of encourage them. Right. Instead, we still live in this deficit mindset. What's wrong with you? What needs to be fixed? And I gave that up many years ago, which is, it's not about fixing what's wrong. It's strengthening strengths. It's building affinities. And the example I would give you is that students, think about it happens right now. I'm a student in high school, and I'm a star player on my basketball team. But I'm having difficulty reading, and I'm not keeping up with coursework, and I'm starting to get C's and D's in my classes. But what's the thing that's my island of competence? What's the thing that keeps me safe? It's playing basketball. What's the first thing we take away from kids when they academically start to struggle? We take away the thing they're good at. Right. Sorry, can't play basketball anymore because you're struggling in school. The very thing that was that life raft is the thing we take away from school, from kids. Right. And especially kids with learning differences. So that's one observation. The other observation I give you is that kids are very, very unique. Students are very unique in the way they learn. And I have a colleague that I work with for many years as well, and he had a great way of thinking of this, which was, and I'll name him because he is a fabulous gentleman, Rick Lavoie, out on the East Coast. And he has a series of videos that he made that we used a lot in teacher education. And one of the videos, he talks about how in some kids, just the synchronization of their internal clocks is always off. It's, they have three, imagine it's 3 clocks running in their head, and one's at 3, one's at noon, one's at 2 p.m., and they're never synchronized. But every so often in human learning, they synchronize. They wake up, going in the classroom, and they're hitting on all cylinders. And they're just doing everything. And these are kids that have been struggling for many, many years. Right. But it's interesting because Rick Lavoie's advice, and there's an element of really truth and wisdom to this, is he used to tell families, on those days when your kids have the synchronized clocks, keep them home from school.
Really?
And so you kind of wonder, well, why would you do that? The kid's hitting on all cylinders. And his response is, because the teacher will hold them to that standard every day then on. Mm-hmm. So think about that. The one day you're showing up and you're doing all this, and then, and many students have heard this, which is, you did it yesterday. Right, why can't you do it today? What's wrong with you? And then where does it go? You're lazy. You're not paying attention. It has nothing to do with that. Right. It has to do with, am I in the right sync? Am I in the right style of where I'm going to be able to be most effective? It's not surprising that a lot of students that I've worked with over the years later as adults will share with me that they wound up dropping out of school, but they found professions where it wasn't based on an 8 to 3 time clock because they never learned that way. The clocks were never synchronized. So they go into woodworking, they go into art. There's a phenomenon in psychology called flow. Famous psychologist Michele Csikszentmihalyi, who identified this. And flow means psychologically when you're doing something and time melts away. So you're not watching the clock. You're doing a podcast. You're doing a piece of video where all of a sudden time melts away, and now 3 hours have passed, 7 hours have passed. Well, you see a lot of individuals that have been identified as having dyslexia, learning disabilities, learning differences. They will find other professions where they're not held by the clock. Right. And they will have periods where it's intense flow. They'll work intensely over 2 days straight, not sleeping. Then on the third day, they'll crash. School doesn't provide you the agility to do that. We don't do night school, day school. We don't do it on off days. And because the inflexibility of the system, it creates these deficits or perceived deficits in students. No fault to their own, just structural in terms of what happens.
Right. Was that moment when you encountered that poor woman sobbing, was that the light bulb switch? Was that just it for you? Like, okay.
It was part of the light bulb switch. I mean, it certainly was something that I think even younger than going to college, I had an innate sense of, and something that still to this day, it bothers me all the time. I hate inequities. I hate people that abuse power. I guess one could call you in a very blunt way, I'm just an underdog. I like the underdog. I like to support it. I don't like people being taken advantage of. And I think in a lot of cases, there are a lot of fields that I've interacted with where, again, if you take a deficit mindset, people take advantage of that. They wind up pigeonholing people. They wind up making decisions about them, and they can never come out of it. And that bothers me at all levels. The example I give you is that another part of my journey after college, and I'll go back and forth as we can discuss it, I wound up finding myself entering a doctoral program. This doctoral program was a joint program between University of California, Berkeley, and San Francisco State University. This is in the mid-'80s. And while I was there at the universities, during the day I worked as a co-coordinator of services to students with learning disabilities at UC Berkeley. And I want to tell you, as both a K-12 teacher, then a person in teacher education, eventually after Berkeley, I got to see a lot of young adults that would come into Berkeley, and there were a couple phenomenon that were fascinating that I saw that changed. There was another light bulb that went off. The fascinating thing I found in a lot of those kids, and if this can help anybody as part of this podcast, I want people to really think about this or reflect on it. I met a lot of students that eventually got into Berkeley, but they had all these areas where they had learning differences that they had been camouflaging for years. Invariably, when I would interview these young adults, they would say, yeah, I was identified for a gifted program in elementary school, in math, in art, in science, in English. And then what happens, I call it a halo effect. All of a sudden, they hear that they're gifted in an area. Their parents hear that. And so think about this. The halo effect is, well, you're gifted in this. You're gifted in everything. So what's completely incompatible with that is you're gifted in math. Why can't you read? You're gifted in math. Why can't you write? You're gifted in math. Why can't you spell? So a lot of these students earlier on in their trajectory, they would wind up camouflaging all that. How did they camouflage it? They camouflaged it by working twice as hard. If other kids in the class, have to work on an hour of homework, I got to do 3 hours if it's a reading assignment. Now that can become hidden. It can be camouflaged until they get to a transition. So then you're going from elementary to middle school, work doubles.
Right.
You go from middle school to high school, work increases. You go to college, and now I'm getting not 1 book assigned a week, I'm getting 5 books assigned a week. I'm losing the time game because I can't now work 3 more hours than all the rest of my classmates. It starts breaking down. So what happened with this halo effect, they kind of hid this for years, worked triply hard, but once they got to Berkeley, all of a sudden with the workload increasing, it fell apart. And this was emotionally devastating because now I've got to face something that I've hidden all these years, and my compensatory strategies are not going to work. And that's indeed what the situation was. And it scared them. It was emotional, devastating. And then there was an emotional overlay, which is now, although I've hidden this and kept it invisible from peers, I now am going to have to go and need counseling. I'm going to need support. And one of my jobs as a co-coordinator, as a counselor, I would recommend a bunch of accommodations for students. So in some cases, the way you get some help on this is extended time on an exam, extra time for reading assignments, extended deadlines on papers, peer tutors or note takers, because I really have difficulty writing and spelling, but a note taker can help me. So we provide these supports, but then think about it. I'm identified as gifted. Everyone in my life has always thought of me as gifted, and I'm incredible, and I'm coming to UC Berkeley. What do you mean you need more time on a test?
Right.
What do you mean you're going to need a note taker? And then there is a great deal of shame that comes with that. I'm not going to tell my professor. My professor's going to think I'm stupid. And worse yet, they're going to think I don't belong.
Yeah, how did I get here?
Right. So then talk about an imposter syndrome on steroids. So what would happen?
Crushing.
It's
just crushing.
And I could find the students. Day one, when I started counseling a student that came to Berkeley, I started working on advocacy skills, because at the end of the day, I tried to get the students in a place where they could go in and have a conversation with a faculty member they were attending their class without hyperventilating, because they were waiting for the professor to shame them, to say that they couldn't do certain things. And it happened more often than not.
Wow.
I will share with you a story where it's connected, and this is a very unfortunate story and experience I had, where I had a faculty member where the faculty member would not provide any accommodations, wouldn't do anything.
I know that, Professor.
And part of my job, and this is, by the way, the vast majority of faculty, I in no way want to paint with a broad brush.
Yeah, no,
the vast majority of faculty I work with were compassionate, sympathetic. How do I learn about this? I want to make sure this student can succeed in my class. That was the vast, vast majority. But every so often, I had one. And this one, again, like I mentioned, that poignant moment of the woman crying on the second floor lounge at Northwestern. At UC Berkeley, I had a professor, and every so often, I would meet with some of the faculty, especially if they had questions about accommodations. And there was no way this gentleman was having any of it. He was not going to provide any accommodations. And finally, it got to a place where I said, well, I see I can't get any further. I'm going to ask you one more time, because now I'm going to have to refer this to the Office of Civil Rights. This is an issue now where there's discrimination against somebody with a disability, and you haven't sufficiently answered me why. And the person then said something that to this day, again, it was a chilling experience I had. The person turned to me and said, I'll tell you why. Because I have a learning disability, and I had to suffer in my school, and it made me who I am, and I'm going to make him suffer.
What?
And I thought to myself, I can't solve that. I can't help that.
That's his chip on his shoulder.
My reflection is, I wish, to your earlier point, I wish I could have worked with you as a student when you were younger. I could have prevented this cycle of emotional violence that was being committed on this student that's in your class right now. Now, again, that is really, in my experience, it's been the exception to the rule.
Right.
But it does encapsulate the shame, the notion of survivability, of it made me who I am. And I often find that in the teaching world, people sometimes have the wrong outcomes in mind for what they want for students. I often hear people say things like, well, the student has to do this because they're going to have to handle the real world. You're going to have the rest of your life to handle the real world. Our job is to protect, serve, do no harm, back to my parents' medical background. And I think in teaching sometimes we should lead with that, which is your job first and foremost is to do no harm. There are going to be times when you're going to give cool feedback. There are going to be times when you have to support and it's not going to be comfortable. Sometimes there are unfavorable things that happen. But on average, you need to make sure that those students leave with more positives than negatives, that they're being upwardly mobile and you're being supportive of them.
Yeah. It's like you said, it's not the majority. It's extreme minority of one teacher, but it only takes that one to absolutely crush that kid. And they're done. They drop out. They don't want to do their thing. And now you've got just a spiraling out of control student that's lost, done, finished.
Right.
And
it's hard to get those individuals back. It really is. It's hard to get them back because it goes to the core of who they are. So that's a second. You were asking about light bulb, and did the light bulb go off there? So there's a second twinkle light that kind of
that's a massive one.
I hold very close in terms of, the do no harm, be very careful. Like you said, something like that experience is so extreme. But kids, in some cases, they're not vulnerable from the standpoint of being fragile, but they can be vulnerable emotionally for really paying attention to adults that they see as role models, as people to aspire to. And that's why you have to also be very careful of how you give cool feedback, because that 5 minutes where you just had a bad day and you just snapped at a student, in some cases, based on where they are, they won't forget that for the rest of their life either. By the alternate, sometimes it's the 2 minutes that you say you can do it. I believe in you. That will put them in a whole different kind of safe, protective area where they're going to be able to overcome anything. And you hear a lot of individuals that talk about that experience. So if I can, I'm going to give you the third twinkle light. And this was also interesting. So I'm kind of taking you through the gamut of a mother who was not kind of didn't work through what did this mean, starting with a label as opposed to what can you do with your son or daughter right now, going to the professor who was not going to accommodate. And I'll give you a third one. This is the triangulation. This was the unburdening of an adult who all of his life had thought something was really broken in him or wrong with him. So another faculty member I had, in this case, teaching learning. I was learning, being mentored by this faculty member, an exceptional person, one of the most brilliant faculty I've ever worked with in my career. And it's funny because when I was taking classes with this gentleman, he had, because of my background, he had some of the telltale signs that I would look for that might identify that you might have had a history of learning disabilities. So the examples would be things like misspelling everything on the board and apologizing and saying, look, I just don't spell. Things like if you turn in a paper and if it's one page beyond 5 pages, I'm going to mark you down a grade.
Right.
So these were indicators for me that there might be a language-based issue that the person had transcended, but still there were some echoes of it. So anyway, the long story short is, after I had finished the course, this professor who I really admired said, I have to ask you a question, Mike. Just so I know, I was teased when I was a kid. I was called a streff.
A streff? What's that?
So he said I was called a streff. Do you know what that is or what was that about? And I said, I got to tell you, because of my area of study, because of what I've been doing, I think I have your answer here. And this goes back to the whole field of learning disabilities and dyslexia. During the late 50s, early 60s, the term that was used was not dyslexia. It was not a reading disorder. Instead, it was called twisted symbols, that students would see twisted symbols. There was a term for it. Get ready for this. The term was strephosymbolia, twisted symbols.
Interesting.
This was coined by one of the early founders and kind of people that was in the space of thinking about dyslexia and learning disabilities, also called word blindness. But twisted symbols, and it was used, this medical term, strephosymbolia, was used. So now, given what I shared with you at the outset with the mother who had heard that her child was retarded, back in the day, my speculation is that somehow parents or somebody was talking to this gentleman's parents when he was a young kid and said, your kid has strephosymbolia. All he heard and all that others heard was streff, the first part of it,
right.
But it was being used in the same pejorative way that retardation would be used.
Sure.
All his life, he had felt something was wrong, and why was he called this, and what did it mean? When I shared with him what the meaning was and the history, it was like he had been unburdened from 200 pounds on his shoulders, because all this time I didn't know what it meant. Is it something more serious? No one had demystified that. And so that notion that I really subscribe to as an educator is one of our key roles is to demystify concepts, try and not use jargon, try and not use the shortcut to talk about just parts of an individual versus holistic. And when you use a label, going back to labels again, this thing was definitive for him and had put him on a whole path of can I ever learn? And actually he was a brilliant professor and had achieved top status. So he had overcome it, but at what cost? I mean, that's a hard road to go for years, carrying that around your neck.
Why do you think it was so late, 60s, 70s, 80s, for this kind of understanding of what, the communication disorder, dyslexia being one? Why was that so late in the game for understanding in the education system?
I still think we have a long way to go. I think that the whole field of neuroscience is still emerging. There are things we're learning about every day which push our thinking about how does the brain work, how does neurochemistry work. And I still think in some ways we're still somewhat in an infancy stage in terms of how do you really understand this. Back in the day, the only way that you thought about individuals who had dyslexia, I'll use that as the example,
right.
It comes from the medical term alexia. Alexia means acquired reading disorder. So it was based on individuals that had head trauma. So if all of a sudden you were normally functioning and you had head trauma and now you couldn't read, you were said to acquire alexia, right? Dyslexia is developmental alexia. So it means we don't know that you had a head injury, but we know developmentally something happened or some change happened where all of a sudden the functioning came out another pathway. And so we've never understood really yet how to do it. One of the things that's pushed our thinking about this is functional MRIs. And functional MRIs basically are looking at the brain as it lights up as you read, don't read, have difficulty with word attack skills. That's pushed our thinking in neuroscience about we can now see that there's certain parts of the brain that light up based on how you read. And it can also, by comparison, show you if there are other parts of the brain that don't light up or should light up, or do you take another path to get to that? So that for me was very fascinating as a young student going back to Northwestern. The whole idea of neurology, of neuropsychology, of neuroscience, still to this day is just completely intriguing to me.
That's interesting you say that, because when I was 7, I was part of a study at Irvine for that, because they were starting to figure out, okay, this kid's got dyslexia, he's a mess, his B's and D's are constantly flipped. I spent like a week there with probes in my head and little things all connected up, and they had me reading and looking at charts and all this stuff with what you would thought casting for a bunch of 7-year-olds at Irvine for a week.
Yep.
And that's what it was.
And I participated in those studies on the side of trying to read some of that. There have been EEG readings that have been used, fMRIs. There were ocular movements that were tracked. There were kids where they used to focus on their pupils and have them read. And then there were a whole variety of theories as to what caused reading disorders and why students, how you could see it and track.
Color shades?
Color shades is an interesting one. So color shades was actually in the Cal State system. There was a faculty member who was really at the forefront of looking at this and whether or not different shades of paper or words on paper could change the ease with which you were able to read. Many students talk about historically and to this day that after a while of reading, their eyes get fatigued.
Right.
And all of a sudden, when their eyes get fatigued, they can't read much longer. The words start, according to them, swimming on the page. So the educator, and this was in the Cal State system, who was a forethinker in this, started experimenting with other shades of paper and did that reduce the fatigue. And it even got to a place where there were lenses that were created for students where it would wind up decreasing the fatigue. And actually, here's the news, it worked. So kids would say, I could read longer, it was easier for me to read. I used to use it with our teacher preparation candidates where I would have them, they couldn't prescribe lenses, but they could print their work for reading in class on different shades of paper. So instead it's light blue, it's light green, it's not white. Turns out that white light has all the colors of the spectrum, and it overly kind of fatigues your rod and cone cells in your eyes. Whereas when you use different shades, it doesn't use all of them simultaneously, and it allows you to read longer. The mistake is that often when you have something that works for one part of support for kids, we often extend it into other areas, and then you get into danger. So, as I just described to you, those lenses or the paper, the different colors, would allow you to read longer. It wouldn't teach you to be a better reader.
Right, no.
But some people inadvertently prescribed them or recommended them for students who couldn't read in the first place.
Oh.
And the idea there is something that did work, being generalized to an area that was never intended to address, and then parents would get completely frustrated, and so would the kids.
Right.
Why can you still not read? Why can't you decode words? It had nothing to do with decoding words.
Right, yeah.
It had to do with fatigue. And in many cases, unfortunately, in the United States, we give up on things like this, and we go on to the next fad. That's another challenge I think we have as a society. I love working with my colleagues in Canada. Because they have a whole different philosophy, and I wish we would adopt it more in the United States. I have colleagues that I've worked with in the York School District outside of Toronto, also at the University of Toronto, brilliant people. And they're very funny when we have cross-cultural dialogues. And the one thing they'll say is, you in the United States, we use 95% of the teaching techniques you develop. You guys are brilliant. As Americans, you're developing stuff. Let's take the example of the lenses. You're brilliant in some of these things, but you give up on it too early. You only use it for a year. You go on to something else. Somebody else comes into fad, and then you give up on it. And then their funny story was, we stayed with it for 20 years, and you know what? It's worked,
right?
And it's made a difference. So that was always something I keep close to my heart.
That's the microwave. Life we are. We put it in for 30 seconds. We want our burrito done. We don't put things on the oven.
And it gets worse.
Yeah.
And it's getting worse on that front. We want instant gratification. Whereas when you talk about education, there usually are no shortcuts. There's not something that, like the idea I was going back with the lenses. Getting the lenses are not going to make you a better reader. But over time, maybe you have less fatigue in reading. And what we know about reading is the more you read, the better you are at it. So that is part of the solution. If you can get kids to read longer and not have the words swimming on their pages and fatiguing, reading more, the rich get richer, because as the more you read, the better you get at it. So that is part of it. But, again, we don't hear much about the lenses anymore, or even how it could be used. But still, students respond, in a lot of cases, to not seeing words on a white page. That's why, if you think about a modern Kindle, Kindles have different shades of what you can read. And they also have night reading, where it changes the color of the background. Again, I would trace that all the way back to the lenses. This was something we learned as educators that could help with reducing fatigue.
Yeah, I mean, that bright white wears on you. I just remember my dad pulling me aside saying, you're just going to have to work smarter, not harder. If you get tired reading, just stop. I'm okay with you getting off your desk, leaving the room, 5 minutes, play with the dog, do whatever you do, then go back. But don't stand there for 2 hours pounding your head against the wall trying to read this book, and you're frustrated.
Right.
And then I don't retain anything.
Right.
So then what the hell am I doing? I got to go back and start over again.
Right. I'll say this, your father was very wise. I don't know if he was an educator, but he should have been. He had some good instincts, because that's something we used to see, and we still see in classrooms a lot, which is, I'll just put it this way. Students are not biologically meant to sit in a seat for 90 minutes.
Oh.
I don't care if they're in 5th grade. I don't care if they're 50. No one is designed to do that.
Nope.
But we insist that students sit there, or they do their homework, or they're not being able to be given breaks. Breaks are necessary. A lot of kids will tap pencils on desks as a way of keeping attention. They're trying to focus on what the teacher is saying. And many teachers will say, stop tapping that. It's irritating me and everybody else. And I used to interview young kids and say, tell me about that. What do you do when the teacher says, don't tap the pencil, it's annoying? The kids would invariably say to me, she can't see my feet. Well, and then we had a whole generation of squeeze balls, of ways of kids maintaining attention where it wasn't disruptive of the class. Again, good technique to help students kind of manage their own attention and regulate the way they were able to pay attention. And we can or can't get into this, but I think the modern phenomenon that we're really encountering right now that worries me is that I still think to this day we over-medicate kids.
Oh, God.
We over-medicate them to get them to do the behavior we think they should exhibit that they never were biologically designed to exhibit.
They told my mom that in the 70s. I think we're just going to have to medicate them. And she gave them a big F-U.
And the challenge, well, good for your mom. Your mom was wise also.
Because it was why?
It takes a lot of courage for a parent with a medical professional growing up in a medical family to say, I'm sorry, I'm not going to do that thing you recommend.
Yeah.
But again, think of medication. Medication, I'll put a little disclaimer here. I have seen students that under medication or with medicational support they have a complete 180. They are able to maintain attention in class. They're able to do all kinds of things. And you know what? Thank God. The medication is an intervention, psychopharmacological medication intervention that finally, for the first time, gets them in a space where they can pay attention, especially for students that have ADHD, where they're extremely, and there are two types. It's the hyperactive, I can't pay attention to anything, or hypoactive, meaning I can't even get attention in the first place.
Right.
And these are different ends of the spectrum in terms of how kids spend time attending. However, medicine, in a lot of cases, will dexedrine, Cylert, Ritalin, they'll help get that. But I was always a fan of medicine will get you in this place of clarity, but then you quickly and simultaneously have to teach the student self-regulation skills or techniques they can use without relying on the medication.
Right.
And this
Right.
is controversial. This is controversial because a lot of people will say that the only time I can function is when I'm on medication, and I think for them it probably is true. But it's dangerous as a window, and I'll give you 3 reasons why. The first is, once you're on medication and you feel that the only way you can be in a world where I can pay attention, I can feel normal, you then create magical thinking, meaning if I'm not on the medication, I can't do this.
Right.
That's false. The second thing is, and this still breaks my heart, I still have families that I interact with where they'll say, my kid was struggling in 3rd grade. They've been a straight A student ever since. Medicine has helped them all these years, and they're just phenomenal, and you're getting through high school, and they're applying to college, and this has been for 15 years. And I'm so proud of my son or daughter, but then they'll confide in me. They'll say, when do I get my funny kid back? My kid was really funny before he was on the medication. And the challenge is I don't have the heart to say that funny kid's never coming back. 15 years of this, you now have it's biochemical change.
Right.
And the student's not going to come. Now there are pluses and minuses for that, and it's what you value. But again, I wish I could have had a time machine to kind of use a balance of medication to get you in the space where I could teach you techniques and you could rely more on the techniques and wean yourself from medicine. And I'll again, controversial comment here, but I will tell you what makes me very nervous is every time I tune into television programming, every day I'm seeing 5 or 6 ads, direct ads for any kind of pharmacology, and that makes me nervous because then you're diagnosing yourself with all kinds of things. And believe me,
Yes.
I could give you a list of symptoms and you would come up with 30 diagnoses and you could come up with 30 prescriptions for it. For some individuals that helps and it could be really supported with a doctor's care, but I worry we're taking that out of doctor's care. We're saying basically we're going to directly market to you and you figure out, what you need and you go and demand that of that doctor. It might be the very wrong thing you need.
Exactly.
But anyway, that's a phenomenon we're going to have to wrestle with a society. And in our lifetime, it's changing. It's really increasing with that direct marketing. And it gets me nervous, especially if it could be prescribed. It hasn't yet. But if you start prescribing that to kids or convincing parents that if they had the right medication, their kid's going to be the right way, that gets me all nervous.
Right.
That's biochemically modifying an environment to suit the environment, not the kid holistically.
With me, my mom was in the medical field, so she had an idea, and they just said this. She was a lovely woman, but she was from Germany in a thick accent. She's teaching 2nd grade, so we were all kind of staring at her like, we could barely understand you, but it's our fault. And she said, well, he's not focusing. And my mom said, maybe he's just frustrated. There's a difference that he's busting his butt as much as he can to read. So, best the cat is piss the cat. And it's not the fault of anybody. It's just, well, we're going to have to medicate him. What medication were you going to give a boy in 76, 77? Like, there wasn't Ritalin yet. God knows what they could have given me. And she was like, not a chance. Not happening.
But go deeper also. Think of yourself as your younger self.
Oh, yeah.
Do you have the awareness at that age to understand what's happening to you?
Not at all.
All I know is I'm speculating, but all you would know is my parents think something's wrong. I need to get help, and they're giving me this. Something must be really wrong. Remember
you
my
get
story?
that vibe, sure.
Remember my story of the strep. What is it? There's something wrong, and you have to be very, very delicate and thoughtful about that because the psyche of kids is very impressionable. And when you're doing that, it's much different if you're getting that epiphany as an adult. When you're a young kid, you start going into all these iterations of what's going on and what's really happening here. So you got to be very careful about that. But again, I want to be very clear here, and especially because this podcast, I'm sure, will be heard by a lot of people, that I want to also be clear that I am not saying that medication can't help. I have seen in some cases, and kids in classrooms, that without that medication, they would not have been able to participate at all. The challenge is that in some cases, the medication wound up setting other kids off the edge. So it's not a fine science, and different people react different ways. I can have a full cappuccino at midnight and sleep like a baby at 12:01. I have friends and colleagues that if they have a sip of coffee after noon, they are done. They are wired. And just think, we are all on a range of functioning in terms of how we react biochemically.
Sure.
We're all snowflakes that way. We've got to be careful. That's why, again, under a doctor's care, somebody who's a professional that can monitor it, that's why it's attenuating it. You've got to attenuate what works for that individual. It's not the same between individuals.
Yeah, no, I mean, you said about the pharmaceutical at the end, with all the things that are the side effects. You don't realize just because I give it to patient A and B, that is not the same person.
That's exactly right.
Oh, and let's just take between the sexes, the ages, right? A difference between a 5-year-old boy and a 15-year-old boy who's already in puberty. There's so many different stages.
Yep.
Like, you don't know what medication's going to react for that person. So
that's why the monitoring of it, I think also the idea that, it's the age-old adage that you want to have holistic care, because in my experience, professionals will prescribe or recommend what they're expert at. And so you often need to have a 360 kind of evaluation, because of course, if you go to someone whose expertise is really in dispensing medication, that will be where they'll gravitate to.
That's it.
But maybe the person that's into talk therapy or cognitive, what we call cognitive behavior modification, those people would take a different course. And I find that often it's the combination that winds up working, and it's a recipe of how do you get a person, again, at the end of the day, you want them to not survive school. You want them to flourish in school.
Right.
And in order to flourish in school, you need a bunch of professionals coming around the table. And also I would say that we also discount the voice of parents. Parents, along with teachers, have the best insight into their kids, more so than teachers, and we tend to discount them. We don't tend to start with parents and say, tell me about your son and daughter. Tell me what they react to, what they love to do, because that gives you clues as a teacher as to what learning environments they're going to most respond to. We often don't do that. Again, we try and fit kids as square pegs in the round holes. So if you ask me about learning differences, my argument is everybody has a learning difference. We're all on that level. And I used to have teachers kind of think that way. I would have teachers from time to time that would say to me, I know what you're saying, Dr. Spagna, is correct, but I'm fighting 25 years of training to do this and experience. And I get that. The very fact that they're even questioning it, for me, is positive. That's I used to think, now I think. I'm going to kind of try something different. That's what kids really need.
Yeah. I'm the only one of my 3 brothers that had it. My parents didn't have it. Of my 3 sons, my middle son has it. So when we saw it happening, forming, I was the front advocate for when he was in school to when we're in preschool, when we're in kindergarten, whatever, it's like,
good for you.
Listen, this is what you're going to deal with. This is a situation. This is what it's going to be like. I'm telling you from an expert's point of view, like, this is the way it's going to be. And they were very much still, this was late 2010 maybe, because they kind of put back like, oh, well, you're telling us what to do? Yeah, one dyslexia expert is telling you how to raise this other one. I know exactly what's going to happen.
Well, again, I think modern teachers, and this is really still, even though I'm a provost at a university now, I'm always in my heart a teacher, and
you'll never get rid of that, right? It's a hat you'll always wear.
It's in your soul.
Yeah.
It's in your soul, and if you're a teacher, you're a teacher forever, and I applaud that. And I will tell you that, again, the thing you just described is the thing we need to focus on, which is how do you build these alliances with families? And if you really take the time to listen, what you said, you have a lot of teachers that will, if they're receptive, you have parents come in and say, look, I'm a bad speller. My father was a bad speller. My grandfather was a bad speller. So from that notion, pay attention to it, and then again, use that philosophy of strengthening strengths and finding affinities. And so the example I would give you is that a lot of kids back in our generation, the way that their halo started, or the way that they felt comfortable, let me change that to island of competence, it was in shop class. And so in shop class, look, I could work with my hands, I could read the manuals. I was struggling when I was reading English literature, but I could do the hell out of that. And they found their island of competence. Well, later on, flash forward about 20 years, those individuals, some of them that dropped out of school and worked in auto shops, later, 25 years later, they're reading Moby Dick on a plane, and I'll find it because now that Chilton automotive manual was the gateway for them to later be able to read. And so that's never cut off. You can have individuals later that are in that space. I had a guy once that came to me where he was an adult. This is an interesting story also on the adult side. He was a guy who came to me at the university and said, I'd like to know how you can help me learn to read. He was in his 60s, and he was not a student at the university, but just come in and wanted to talk to a counselor. And so I said, well, tell me your story. And he said, well, I've never been able to read. And I said, well, what do you do now? And he said, well, I'm a captain of industry. I go in and do turnarounds for corporations. When they're really struggling, I go in and I help fix the corporation. And I said, well, tell me, how do you do that? Especially if you're having difficulty reading. So, well, here's my secret. But before I tell you my secret, I'm going to tell you why I'm coming to you. And I said, well, why are you coming to me? Because I just had a grandson, and I want to read to him. And I said, okay, well, I can get you lined up, and we can start doing some literacy work with you. But I said, tell me more about your experience. He said, well, what I would do is I would go into a company, they would arrange a conference, and I'd have them all get into teams, and they bring all their books, all their manuals, and I'd have them talk within their teams about all these challenges they were having. And then I would collect all the books, all their notebooks, and I would go to my hotel room. And I said, well, what did you do then? Because you're having difficulty reading. He said, well, I would stack them all in the corner of the room. I didn't read a word of them. I said, so what would you do? And he said, well, I'd turn on some light music. I'd soften the lights. I'd pour myself a glass of wine. And I have an audiographic memory. I could replay 5 conversations simultaneously in my head as I was able to sort them according to the 5 groups. And my brain is very good at synthesizing things, and I would synthesize solutions and problems, and I'd come in, and I'd bring the books, and they never knew I didn't read them, but as far as I told them, I read all those books, and I'd come up with their solutions, and I had become very effective in that world. So again, think of compensatory strategies, surviving school, making actually a way in his world, but he had to do it on his own terms. But now, think about the halo effect and transitions. Mm-hmm. Now life had gotten in the way. And now this thing that I had neglected all these years, I'd like to pick up.
That's massive.
Yeah.
For you, where were you leaving with your career through college where you're like, I don't want to be a teacher? Like, because you weren't, I think someone like you would have been so effective in like first grade, second grade, third grade. You could have really, and I'm not saying you haven't, but helped kids. That's massive. I would have loved to have had to gone sent to Mike's class and go see you for 45 minutes. You would have been like the blessing of the week.
Yeah, I'd say in my career, in the way I would space out my career, teaching, actual in-classroom teaching with younger kids was the smaller part of my career. And I enjoyed it. I really...
You would have been the most popular guy.
Well, I gravitated to it, and I loved it. The classes that I taught, primarily in middle school, I enjoyed everything about it. And you know about middle school students and middle school teachers, they're a rare breed. So once you're in that space, but I loved it, and especially with students that were struggling, because in many cases they were the place of last hope. They really, and it was very uplifting. I've never considered myself a careerist. Instead, I've always looked at, what can I do to pay it forward? And I think quickly you realize when you're teaching, especially in K-12, that a lot of things are out of your own control. When you're in your classroom with kids, you can actually do a lot. Mm-hmm. But then you find out these other things encroach on those kids, and you don't have power over that. So that led me, logically, to a path where then I became a teacher educator. So I love being in the classroom. I love working with kids. The nice thing about being a teacher educator is now I'm supervising teachers, but I'm also with the kids. So I'm with the kids, in some cases doing demonstration lessons for the person that's learning. I'm supervising them as well. So I have the best of both worlds. I'm spending days in kindergarten through upper elementary to middle classrooms. I'm with kids. I'm able from time to time to do a demonstration lesson. But I also have people that are being prepared that now need all kinds of supports. So what I'm doing inadvertently or directly is I'm trying to ensure that no harm is being done, because I can fine tune. And the example I give you, I had a student teacher once who was really struggling, and a good teacher, and he became an exceptional teacher. But he was an individual where he didn't understand the maxim we sometimes have in special education, which is hurt people hurt. And so what happened was he made a mistake during a math problem on the board, the teacher, and the kids were all over him. You know, you don't know what you're doing. How did they hire you? You're a terrible teacher.
Right.
You know, this is a classic kind of high school, upper middle school.
Sure.
Especially with kids who have been struggling as learners. The first thing they'll do, remember, hurt people hurt. They've been humiliated.
There's blood in the water.
And I'm going to go after you. And it's a phenomenon that happens in teacher education. So I actually debriefed with this teacher, and I said, look, I got to tell you something. You have to realize that the reason why those kids are going so hard after you is they're portraying on you, projecting on you their own insecurities.
Yeah.
See, here's how you diffuse it, all right? 2 ways. First is you have to intentionally make mistakes when you're doing things and say, you know, being perfect is too much pressure. And I am going to purposely, during a couple of my lessons, make mistakes, and here's the game. You guys got to identify it, right? And so you identify it, point it out to me, and I'll correct it.
Yeah, flip it.
And so I'm doing 2 things there. I'm teaching you that there is no perfection. Don't put pressure on yourself to be perfect. And hey, you know what? It's okay to fail. It's okay to make a mistake. No one's perfect. You do that, and you're going to change the whole dynamic. And then he went on from there. He wound up getting that lesson. He wound up doing a great job. But if you go down the other way, which is, no, I'm going to start fighting with the kids, I'm going to start pushing back, that's a no-win situation. And those teachers don't stay in the profession long. They're out of it. And then to finish, your question about, well, if you start as a teacher, how would you ever give that up? So I love being in classrooms. I loved then preparing teachers to be in classrooms. But then again, you start finding things that are more structural that get in the way of good teachers. So I will tell you, we've been experiencing in California a major teacher shortage, and it continues. And I'll go even further. I still am talking to people I prepared 20 years ago where they'll call me up and say, Dr. Spagna, convince me I should stay in. I don't my husband's putting pressure on me. I need to go into our business. I need to go into our accounting business because I can't take it anymore. And the thing is, they can't take the other variables. They love the kids. They like being in classroom with kids. It's the administrative challenges. It's negativity out of other peers. I always know it's a bad sign when a teacher locks him or herself into a classroom at lunchtime because they don't want to go into the cafeteria. This will bum them out. They'll hear some negative stories from peers. God forbid an administrator says a negative thing to them. I just need mana by being with the kids. And we need to do much better in that. So eventually that's what led me to be a teacher ed coordinator, a dean, and then once you're in
CSUN, right?
Yes, at CSUN. And then once you're in that, and CSUN still to this day, they have a fabulous program. They just have done incredible stuff at CSUN, as all the Cal States do. Again, a hidden secret in the Cal State system, you probably know this. The Cal State system prepares 50% of the teachers in the entire state of California.
Right, yeah.
So when you have that magnitude of reach, the way I always view it is thank God for the Cal State system. I don't know where K-12 education would be if not for the Cal State system.
Yeah, because you really had your hands touching them.
Oh, and working with them and working with our colleagues and LA Unified and the other school districts, all great professionals. But at the end of the day, it's getting harder and harder to keep people in the profession. So then you got 2 choices, which is, oh God, what do I do as a professional? Or this is not a profession to stay in. Or, again, not being a careerist, somebody that's looking that, is there something that I'm going to have to work with to solve and pay forward? Then the natural thing is to become a dean of a college of education. And then when you're a dean of a college of education, you're working with all the programs, elementary, secondary teachers, school professionals, school psychologists. But then again, you start finding caveats. You see things where you need more support. That then leads you to be or think about being a provost, because as a provost, you're a chief academic officer.
Right.
So now you're supporting teachers not just in a college of education, but teachers across the whole board. I just finished all of our promotion letters. There is no better time of the year, well, except for maybe definitely for commencement when we're celebrating students and their stories. Super Bowl. But I'll tell you, my close to Super Bowl, my championship game is reading these files because our faculty are incredible. And it's not faculty, it's in the College of Education, but across all our 5 academic colleges. Faculty, pound for pound, in the Cal State system are the best I've ever worked with. And I'm proud of them. I write to them that I'm proud to be their colleague because they're doing things every minute. They're compassionate. They care about students. They have much more intuition than I ever had as a professor coming in. And they have a more challenging job. It's no longer that you can come in and teach a subject or a discipline. You have to now be a professional working with other professionals. You have to be interdependent with them. So whether it's working with Dr. Tiffany Herbert and really getting yourself trained up in how you have to work in mental health areas, basic needs. It's a much more complicated world now in higher ed. It's been this way for a long time in K-12, but now it's finally come to higher ed, and a modern professor has a lot of demands on her or his time in terms of how they go about it.
When you were at Northridge, it was really the technological, from analog to technical in the 90s, from going into digital. Did you see that change teaching-wise in what you were with special ed in teaching in those?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I would say in around the time of the '94 earthquake at Cal State Northridge,
Right, yeah.
it was the emergence of the internet. I remember two of my colleagues who were science educators at CSUN, just fabulous people. I'll never forget, we were in trailers because we were in trailers for 2.5 years. I give every accolade to President Blenda Wilson. She was the president at the time. She had a decision to make after that earthquake, which is, do we shut down the whole campus? And by the way, the reason that the thing that was going to be the fulcrum to close it down is if we couldn't open the library. So was mid-January when the earthquake happened. We had until Valentine's Day, I remember this distinctly. If we couldn't reopen the library, we were going to be closed as a campus. And what it meant then is the faculty at CSUN were going to be sent out and scattered to other CSUs because the campus wasn't going to be able to physically be opened.
And it was devastated.
Oh, it was the epicenter. And
Yeah.
so it was a tough time. But I will tell you, this is the strength of leadership. Blenda Wilson was beyond courageous. She's like, nope, we're not shutting down the campus. We are going to truck in, I think the number was 400 portable trailers, and we are going to teach out of trailers. And you know what? I got to tell you, it got me back in touch with my K-12 teaching days because at the end of the day, I need a place to walk in and I need a place to work with students. And we made it work. But I will tell you, out of that experience, you kind of come through that in a place where you appreciate education, you know how it needs to happen, and it got me reacquainted with those roots on that front. It also showed me the power of a president in the Cal State system of really affecting change and changing the community.
Yeah, she had to step up in a big way because that could have been ugly if
Oh.
everybody got dispersed all over the place. Going from analog to digital has helped me. It's helping my son.
Forgive me.
Yeah.
When you were talking about that, I lost one train of thought there because when we went to the trailers, I remembered sitting up with these two colleagues I mentioned, the science educators, and they had a laptop open. And I think at the time was Netscape Navigator, going way back to that. And so I was standing next to them. We're standing outside in the twilight next to this trailer, and I'm watching their screen. And I knew a little bit about it, but they were science educators, so they were right on top of this. They were the first to start the computer lab, all the rest. So I'm watching them, and just a circle is spinning and spinning and spinning. And then finally an image came up, and they nearly jumped out of their shoes. They're like, oh. And I'm like, what happened, right? I knew it was significant. They said, this is the dawn of the internet. And that digital transformation was something that then from that point took off. And I will tell you, just before I came to Northridge, when I was at Berkeley, I was the coordinator. As I was coordinator there, I got exposed to a lot of technology that was cutting edge. For instance, you might hear about Ray Kurzweil. He had developed a reading machine that I got exposed to when I was up in my doctoral program between Berkeley and San Francisco State. And the Kurzweil reader could take printed text and transform it into, I think there were like 40 languages at the time. Proud Peter, huge Harry. And you could play this, and it was magic. And so that was the dawn of a lot of those accommodation software coming forward. And in education, especially for kids that were struggling learners, these made all the difference because all of a sudden, you had audiobooks. You had the ability that if I had great listening comprehension, but my decoding was really insufficient, I could listen and follow along without putting all my energy into decoding the words. This was a light going on for students that were struggling. And they were able to benefit from the listening comprehension they had versus reading comprehension. The reason this is important at the time, and it set the whole field in a new direction, there were a lot of kids that if you didn't take advantage of the fact that their listening comprehension was so much higher, and you stranded them in younger grade reading comprehension books, it would make them look like they had more levels of mental retardation or cognitive disabilities than they really had, because we weren't taking advantage of their world knowledge, the fact that they had understanding. That's always been the mistake in special ed, putting kids down to the lowest common denominator, and then you're restricting them. They will only go as far as the opportunity you give students to kind of transcend that.
Yeah, no, that was massive. I mean, for me, like I was going to say, is having the ability to have the Apple program rewrite my email or have it speak. Plenty of things that, because with my dyslexia, I will write stuff and fill in my head the words I haven't typed. So I will say, Dr. Michael Spagna, it was really great to see you, and I will forget, or at least not type in the C, but I will keep reading C in there over and over.
Yes. No, the spell checkers, I mean, all the stuff, Drag and Write, all the software programs that have been developed. We have faculty right here at Dominguez Hills who've been working in the library. They are with computer science faculty. They're doing all kinds of things of trying to access the text. So students that get lost in a technical article can wind up having it summarized in a way that they can take advantage of and then read more of the article. So these are all about access and any kinds of accommodations that can happen.
Have you even thought about, I mean, we're looking over at the I&I building with AI and what it possibly could do?
Oh, I think AI, we've had in the field of education many things that were considered disruptive over the years. I remember back in the day, a film strip was considered to be Armageddon. So I look at this a little differently, which is I'm not intimidated by technological advances. It's more of the game of how do you incorporate it into education and learning. So AI, I welcome. Again, like anything else, it's got to be assimilated into how you teach, how you learn. And I'm much more on the side of let's be very transparent about how it can be used. Let's not overpromise it. You know, some of the early use of AI right now in medical facilities is to try and be in the space of diagnosing illnesses. They're 50% wrong.
Sure.
So there will be these emerging, it will not be a panacea, but you embrace it and then see about how you can use it best. And so AI in many ways, by the fact that it's learning as it goes, think of students that are struggling, and like you were using with the spell check model, wouldn't it be different if it learned as you figured out how to do that? And it's basically augmenting the way you're learning without having to be reliant on a person in the room to guide you. So again, if you think about the notion of direct instruction, guided practice, and independent practice, which is the tenet of all teaching, then guided practice is when you're working with the AI, and AI can then help you with independent practice, whereas a teacher would not have the opportunity to work with you in those hours.
Right.
And that would wind up ungluing you from it. I think that the notion of the flipped classroom, of instead of me having to receive all my information from someone speaking, I can get it from other areas. You know, there are a whole bunch of things that I think are very unique and exciting about the educational environment right now. I don't eschew technology. Again, at the end of the day, learning is a socially mediated event. It's about people. It's how we're sitting with each other in physical proximity. There's a big part of that you can't pick up. Even all the years we were in Zoom, even all the years we were trying, there's a convenience of it, but there's nothing that's a substitute for me of just the personalization that happens.
My son, Malcolm, and I, we talk about with the AI and learning, and I said, I might be gone by the time it's where I think you and I would want it, but to have that ability to have it as a tutor in the house and work with that student on reading early, I think they say there's no cure for dyslexia, but you can make it better by practice. Having that ability to have somebody read with you or read along with you,
Absolutely.
and then correct you instantly so that bad habits aren't formed, could be massive. Having, you know, Jimmy the robot in the corner just working along with you going, today we're going to read, and here we go. And nope, well, Mr. Brown, that was wrong. Let's restart over.
No, I agree with you. And something that's dynamic that goes back and forth like that, I don't know if we'll realize it in our lifetime, but I see that happening in a similar way. I'll give you the example that I often defer to. We used to have this experience where you have students that are very accelerated. Let's say they're in 5th grade, and they've already mastered the whole curriculum halfway through the year. will happen in some classrooms. The teacher will say, well, what am I to teach you now? That's the 6th grade teacher's job.
Right.
So you unlock from the notion of telescoping or expanding the realms with which a student can go into. If it's not controlled simply by a textbook or by an individual, if you used AI, I could go into all kinds of things. I now am learning about college level things related to a piece of archaeology that if I was just staying within the textbook for 5th grade, I'd never get access to.
Right.
So for me, access to information, being able to take multiple pathways as a learner, not being dictated by the constraints of a book or a person, that's where AI can really help. And you can do deeper learning on that. It comes with a challenge.
Sure.
And the challenge, going back to the internet, is I think, unfortunately, we all dreamt of the day in an information age that the internet was going to unlock everything. Unfortunately, I think our experience requires a little more investigation. I think in some ways it backfired on us and continues to backfire on us because it hasn't promoted critical thinking, exchange of ideas. Instead, in some ways, it's solidified silos. And it's basically said, look, you can go in your echo chamber and just do confirmation bias all day long. So then I'm never forced to get out of my comfort zone. I'm never forced to look at something from another person's perspective.
Right.
Then you have a scary society where a lot of people are locked off from each other of dialoguing. I used to tell teachers when we graduated them from CSUN, the first thing I'd say is you have 2 jobs as you come out of this university with your brand new credential. One is help students find their community. There are a lot of students out there that they just don't have a community. The second is I want you to preach this over and over and over again. It's not a sign of weakness to change your mind.
Right.
But we have a world right now where people are canceled, they're vilified for the fact that they want to see something from a different perspective.
Or they're scared to even say they might have a different idea.
Because if I do that, I am going to be vilified. That's not the world we want to live in.
No.
You want a world where people are interacting. And I got to tell you, it's music to my heart when someone says, I don't know enough about that. I'm going to have to do some more study. We are in a world where that's not, that again is seen as a level of weakness, which is why don't you know the answer? Well, no one can know the answer. The whole job is to find out more, to take another perspective. That's critical thinking. And I think that's what the university does quite well in terms of building a democracy. And we can't ever give that up. People often say to me, like, are the humanities dead? Are the arts dead? Is AI going to kill art? Is it going to kill humanities, ethnic studies? No, absolutely. That is the fundamental bedrock of a democracy. If somebody said it the other day in a meeting we were in, which is, I can get my job and I can be thriving in the workplace, but so what if I'm not enjoying it? If I'm not reading literature, taking advantage of art, getting exposed to other cultures, so what? So that is the totality, the holism of higher education that I think we all need to celebrate.
When you started early on in your career and the time you were still teaching, did you evolve as a teacher?
Every day. To this day, I'm evolving as a teacher. I think that the notion of continuous improvement, not constantly refining what you do, every day you're learning something different. I'd say there are 3 stages in teaching. The first couple of years, you're just keeping your head above water. So you're drinking through a fire.
I hear that a lot.
You're drinking through a fire hose, and how do I do this, and how do I set it up? Usually by around years 4 and 5, you're starting to get more automatic. You now have a history. You know how to set this up. And it's not until you're after 5 years in a profession that then you start, kind of taking off from that. Interesting story on that front. I interviewed, when I was part of a team at CSUN, we interviewed a person who had done her dissertation on the most effective teachers in the state of Tennessee. And so she had been studying teachers that no matter what class they had over a several-year span, they could have major progress happening with these kids. Just they were going through the roof. So I'm going to tell you 2 parts of the story. The first part is she studied the teachers that were just, no matter who they had in their classroom, they were doing phenomenal work. And she then went and videoed them, and she would then interview them. And so she found out there were certain things that all these teachers had in common. One was they loved kids, first and foremost. They loved kids, loved being around kids. 2, they had a great affinity and alliance with parents. They wanted to build bridges. 3rd, they would diversify and differentiate their instruction. They were able to do stuff on the fly. So instead of just teaching the middle of the class one thing, they're doing 5 reading groups. They're doing stuff simultaneously, different materials. So all 3 of those things, they just had done extremely, extremely well. And then finally, they were great at classroom management, not behavioral management, like sit in your chair.
Right.
It was they had the materials set up. They kids knew where to go. They ran like clockwork. So those 4 things. And I said, was there anything else you found among these teachers? 100 most effective teachers in Chattanooga, Tennessee was where she studied this. He said, yeah, all of them, Mike. She didn't know my background. He said all of them, interesting enough, had been special ed teachers at some point. Think about that.
Really?
That made me very proud of my profession, but it tells you again, special ed teachers in many ways are just effective teachers. They're ones who cared about families, loved the kids, were great at differentiating instruction, and they had to build instruction. So it worked for the class. So I love that. The corollary of the story, which is funny, I'll tell you that in a minute, but she also then interviewed these people and said, well, how do you do this? And you know what they often said after watching hours of themselves? I can't explain it. I can't tell you why I do that.
Right.
It's just
the way I work.
But every so often, she'd get one of the 100 that would say, well, I do it this way, and I base it on this, and this is why I set it up. Those people are the ones you want in teacher education, because they're the ones who are going to train the next generation of teachers, right? You can't just put somebody in a classroom with teachers in training and say, it's magic. You've got to unpack it. So again, that kind of taught me a lesson. Then the final thing I'll say is this, which is interesting. She also did another study of the 100 least effective teachers.
How did that go?
The superintendent, principal brought them in and said, I want to call you into the office. 100 teachers come in. This was the weird phenomenon. 50 teachers on the spot, 50% said, I know why I'm here. I need to leave the profession. I've been waiting all this time for someone to realize I shouldn't be here, and I don't want to do it, and I'm out of here. Think about that.
Wow.
So again, I don't blame that on those teachers. I blame it on a system that should have been supportive of them. You need a system where the principals are learning leaders, they're in classrooms constantly and supporting them. So 50% on the spot say, I know why I'm here, I'm out. The other 50 teachers, guess what they said? I still love kids, I still want to do this, can I get help? So guess what that superintendent did? He paired them with some of the teachers in the most effective group. And they all continued and had their craft elevated. We need to do more things like that in terms of what we do in teaching.
And you know this. There will be burnout. There will be struggles. There will be difficult times. Their personal lives. Like, right? Don't bring your personal life to work. Well, that's almost impossible. If you have a bad day at home and you come in, you're going to be a little angry. That 2nd grade class is going to feel your energy. Supporting those teachers and making them feel like there is support has got to be the best thing ever. Yep. You would do that if you were a cop in the military or if you were working on an assembly line.
Right. Well, I've also became a fan when I was at CSUN as a dean of education. I got very much into comparative education in other countries, and we have so much to learn. We have a lot of arrogance in the United States. We know how to do it. Remember, like what I said about the Canadian observation about we use 95% of what you guys develop, but you don't stay with it. When you look at other countries, for instance, Finland, we do something in the United States which I wish we could wave a wand. We have a lot of perverse incentives for teachers. We pay them very little on the front end. We put them through a ringer. We hope they survive through the obstacle course. But then they hold on to the end because on the other side of it, you do get a good pension. Mm-hmm. You do get tenure. You get retirement. But why do we force them to suffer for so many years through this? So that's one thing. We got to change those perverse incentives. You got to, and it's not a lot. There's a report by McKinsey and Company that says if you just change the salary on the front end by several tens of thousands of dollars, you'd transform the whole system. You wouldn't have people fleeing, But so that's a conversation for another day. However, the other thing that they did in Finland especially is that once teachers in the United States, once you've been in the career for 20, 30 years, you don't have other paths to go unless you're going to become a principal or go an administrative route. To your earlier point, it takes you out of the classroom. The thing you did well, we're now making you have to leave because otherwise you can't get advancement. There's a problem with that.
Right.
In Finland, they give you other tracks, so you can become a curricular expert where you're developing curriculum for all your other peers. You can do things in administration. You can do other things in psychological work. So they give separate paths for teachers once they get to a certain place in their profession where you don't have to stay in the same area being in the classroom. And many teachers, by the time they're in the classroom for 20, 30 years, they want to try something different. They want to be learning leaders. They want to organize other teachers. They want to work at universities being teacher educators. We don't give them those options. Every time I'm at any party with anybody that's in the classroom now, I said, look, keep my card. Call me in 10 years. I got a second gig for you.
Right.
And then that's a whole nother act for them. I was effective in the classroom. Now I can kind of pay it forward with preparing future teachers. And I can let them learn from the wisdom that I've accumulated over the years. We don't take advantage of that either because they're burned out and they've left the profession. So we don't have that recycling of the expert teacher that can help the novice teacher.
So to be a teacher, let's say teach 4th grade in Iowa, right? You got to have just a degree and then a certificate.
Yep.
To teach teachers, like if you're at CSUN, you have to have a master's at least?
You have to have a master's degree, and
Okay.
the master's has to be in that field. You have to show that you've been in classrooms. You have to show that you've been a practitioner, and then you're constantly getting professional development. So a lot of masters, people with teaching credentials and masters work as practitioners. We call them university supervisors that are in colleges of ed. If you're on a tenure track, then usually you have a doctorate, either an EDD or a PhD. And the reason for that is you're also doing research.
Right.
And research and teaching are inextricably linked. In order for you to be an effective teacher, you also need to do research and vice versa. If you're not doing that, then you're not moving forward. And you can't teach the way you taught 15 years ago.
Right.
They're a constant, continuous improvement. You need to be in those spaces of research, creative activity, teaching, and rinse, repeat cycle. And so those are the most effective teachers.
Well, think of teaching kids before the smartphone and then after the smartphone. That's
Yeah,
a whole different
totally
child.
Totally different.
My question with that was, you know what, like sometimes like you'll see a basketball coach, they'll bring in a young coach, but then they bring in some 35, 40-year-old veteran, white-haired guy sits on the bench. It's seen everything. Nothing's going to surprise him. They bring him in, he helps with practice, he does his thing. Why isn't there something where the teacher at some point after 30 years, why don't they have them go teach teachers, but they don't have a master's? Like that would seem like it would be a good step for really good teachers to advance and help others.
Well, I think I think the profession is always changing, and I'm not going to disagree with you. The idea of having top practitioners work with emerging teachers, I would never argue against. I don't stand on ceremony of whether or not you need advanced degrees to be able to do that. You can have just as much wisdom in somebody who's been a 30-year practitioner than somebody that got a doctorate.
Right.
The difference is whether or not you have the level of inquiry. And again, an advanced degree gets you into a way of thinking. And so that's the only difference I would put, which is sometimes that gives you an elevated way of considering problems, getting into scientific inquiry, and I think that's important in any profession. So, but I would never say that you would restrict that kind of supervision or support just because someone doesn't have a degree.
Right. I'm just thinking of like the real boots on the ground.
Oh,
Like,
yeah.
I was in the classroom last semester. I
Yeah.
could tell you how it really is.
Oh, yeah.
You know,
And I think there's a value to that. I think the other value is, and we're working towards this, I always found in my career that, again, you're teaching most of these classes, they're kind of the hardest audience for learners in higher education because they've been working all day. So they're working 8 to 3. Then they're coming to a class. And when I taught at CSUN, I'm teaching 4 to 7 and 7 to 10. So imagine a student all day long teaching in a classroom till 3 o'clock and then coming to back-to-back classes for 6 hours of instruction twice a week and expecting them to be effective. So I always learned from that perspective, you have to start with something they can use tomorrow. So again, you can give theory, but you've got to start with the practice. This is the thing, okay, what are you dealing with right now? How can I help you? What are you going to do tomorrow in the classroom? Tell us how it worked out. Show video clips of how it could be employed. Then back that up with theory and literature as opposed to leading with it. And I think that's changed in the profession quite a bit over the years.
Yeah.
And the incorporation of professionals too. And so your point of we still have a little ways to go of incorporating the experts out there. Again, use that model of the Chattanooga, Tennessee. The most effective people that want to be in it, but they're not as effective. But again, a lot of people can't explain their craft. So you got to make that distinction too. Simply putting you with somebody that's been out in the field for 20 years might not be enough. It's somebody that can then explain it, and someone that can show you, and someone that can unpack it. And not everybody has that skill.
Yeah, especially if you can hook them up with a rookie.
Yeah.
First, second year, and help them. Well, let me guide you the way. They're going to be a little squirrely, but this is what we do. This is what works.
Yep.
That's kind of the best thing.
Yep.
Would you do it all over again?
Absolutely. It's been a great ride, and it's given meaning. It's given meaning to everything I've done. And I want to tell you, like, even going through this, it's been really helpful because I think we often don't take that journey back, like what were the motivations and what took us there. So I really appreciated the conversation because I do it all over again. It was very fulfilling. I left myself open to and continue to leave myself open to the notions that you have to continuously be in this space of learning. And then I'll end where I started, which is, we didn't get into this topic as much, but for me, at the end of the day, these are things about equity. They are things about trying to reach out to students. And I think we still have an environment now where we need to kind of get our priorities straight. Yeah. And the example I would give you is, I just used this the other day, there's still states in the United States that base their prison population projections on third grade literacy rates. And if we think about that we know what we're going to have to do to build future prisons based on how many kids are quote-unquote literate at the end of third grade, that is, again, a perverse way of thinking of it.
Yeah.
Why wouldn't I put all my resources into lifting the literacy of every third grader in the United States? I don't want anybody to go to prison, right? But that takes a lot of resolve, takes a lot of courage to kind of change that perspective. So I think we have a long way to go. And like you said, being a kid going through education in the 70s, 2024, we still haven't hit the summit. We still have a lot of work to do.
I mean, they're saying that there's 40 million people in the U.S. with dyslexia, but only 2 million diagnosed.
Exactly.
That's a lot of chunk of people just wandering around thinking either they're stupid, they're uneducated, they just can't learn. It's me, I don't know what it is. I mean, that's frightening.
But let me, if I can, give you a different way of thinking about it, because you could hear that statement and say, we are underdiagnosing. We got to screen, better diagnose, get these people assistance. Go back to where I started. Giving the label of dyslexia isn't going to help one kid. Instead, I've got to rethink the way that I provide an environment and teaching to support that kid regardless of the label. And if we could achieve that, you're looking at the other lens, where kids are being valued, they're being supported, go back to those effective teachers, then you have an environment where kids are being appreciated. I used to give an exercise where I would say, look, I'm going to give you the diagnosis of autism. What does that tell you about a kid? What are you going to do tomorrow with a kid? Well, I don't know. Exactly, right? Giving you the identification of dyslexia gives you a couple things to think about, but it's not until you're working with that kid that you're in that space of being able to understand it. So I sometimes get nervous when we start thinking of dyslexia as a category, like measles, like we're going to identify it and you know what, you're dyslexic, you're not. I don't see it as a category like that. I don't see it as a medical phenomenon that needs to be categorized and cataloged. Instead, I see it as a continuum. And on that continuum, our whole job is to move students along on that continuum. So yeah, I'm struggling. Yeah, I'm having word attack at young ages. I'm going to get you some word attack skills. I'm going to give you phonemic awareness support. You're going to get over that. Your listening comprehension is going to become more aligned with your reading comprehension. I now have solved that. I never had to use the word dyslexia. The reason why it's come into play is because I think we're more comfortable with a thing to think about, but in some ways it's just as dangerous of using that label, because then it gives people a lot of excuses to not get into things. Again, we didn't get into the subject, but there is a whole train of thought in the academy, and I subscribe to it, that dyslexia has been used in some cases to be an excuse for school failure.
Oh, yeah.
And so
Absolutely.
what happens is I'm going to identify these kids as dyslexic, but at the end of the day, I didn't support those kids.
Right.
And it's let us off the hook. And by the way, I'll go even further than that. It's been used, particularly learning disabilities has been used to explain failure of black and brown kids because we haven't intervened in the sufficient ways to support them. So instead, at the end of the day, we can go to sleep at night and say, yeah, well, they're dyslexic or they have learning disabilities.
Yeah.
And at some level, you give up on them, right? And that's not what kids need. It's not what children need. They need holistic environments that are better attuned to what their needs are, as opposed to we force them into places where they've got to show us. That's why whenever you talk to me about a timed test, I often will refute that and say, why are you giving a timed test? Is that because it's convenient for you? You as a teacher don't want to sit in the classroom for beyond an hour?
Right.
There's a difference between a power test and a speed test. And a power test, again, going back to my days of accommodating, a power test is I want to see what you know. It's not time bound. As soon as I put time bound on it, then I'm not measuring necessarily how much you know. I'm knowing how fast you can do it.
Right.
Or have you mastered taking that test? That's one of the reasons why I think we've seen the rolling back of SAT and ACT tests,
yep.
because we've tried to standardize kids. We try and get them into a number, and the number is not going to tell you anything. And we've seen now with this Operation Varsity Blues, this large federal case, you can manipulate those numbers, and those numbers in some cases are more a measure of privilege than they are really of whether or not how smart you are versus how you are smart. And so we got to unlock that too. We tend to kind of get to that level, which is very dangerous, where you'll tell me whether the student's smart or not. There's no such a thing. It's how you're smart. Remember the halo effect. You have kids that are smart in all kinds of ways, but we tend to try and we're more convenient to lump it into a number, a category.
It's very easy too for a school or administration to go, well, they're dyslexia. Good. There's 2% we don't have to deal with. We'll just knock that off our, failure rate or our quality of tests. That's the way it is. Because I remember, what is it, 7th grade? You take this state test.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
And they were wanting to pull me off that test so bad, and my mom and dad had to fight tooth and nail. What am I going to drag down? Rancho Starbucks, junior high testing score by. But they no, you don't need to take the test. My mom and dad were like, the hell he is. We want to know. We got to know what he's strong at. We know where he's weak at. Yeah. And it was
the idea of
so
individual profiles, and thinking about students as these individual profiles. That's where you really need to go. Where are the areas that they're strong at? How do you support those strengths? I come back to the issue of affinities. It's not identifying the areas of weakness. That doesn't get you there. And when you collapse students to a test score, you probably know this. There's an assessment that's given to all 15-year-olds in the world. It's called the Program International Student Assessment. And the United States for years has been losing ground compared to the rest of the world in math and in language skills. There's one area in the United States that our kids outperform the rest of the world. Do you know what it's in?
No.
The belief they can do something.
Really?
They measure that, like your confidence.
Right.
I love that. We have to take advantage of it. You don't want to squash that.
So you don't hear that. You always hear that
you don't
India's crushing us by 20% or what?
We have the belief we can do it. We outpace the rest of the world in that. You don't hear that. You're right. But then think about what makes America unique. It's the Apples, it's the Googles, it's the inventions, it's the innovations. Do you really want to get rid of that? So anyway, that's just something.
No, but that's very true.
Just think about it.
I think that's ingrained in us, though.
It is, but not if you have to survive school. So you gotta innovate. I want those future innovators to come forward, but it's hard to do that if you're constantly knocking people down and saying, "But you don't do this. You can't do this well." It's islands of competence. It's rely on that. I'd rather have kids that are very confident, and how do I build on that confidence? And I don't squash it. I keep that going.
Are you surprised? Second floor, Northwestern, you stumble upon that poor woman, that you would be here today. Like that was kind of like that chain, that career path where you're like, I'd love to just help this woman and help her. And now you're here.
I think that was a primary motivating function, because I knew that there was an injustice. I couldn't put my finger on it beyond the labeling, but it allowed me to pull on a string that unraveled a rug, which is these levels of injustice I see all over the place. And so the issue then becomes, how do you reveal it? How do you try and address it? How do you make a world a better place? And I think that that's what spurred me by seeing that. You don't want anybody that is desperate where, it could have gone a different road. Sure. It could have gone, again, it focused so much on the diagnosis. It didn't focus on how can we support your son now? What are we going to need to do? How are we going to do that? Instead, it left her with a box. And that was the thing that I most regret, and the unfortunate thing is we still do that every day. Do that to families and kids all over the place, put them in a box, tell them that this is their label, this is who they are. And I think we're going to have to really continue to interrogate that.
How can you make it better? How can you help them with that?
It starts with the adults in your life and the adults you have exposure to, where you wind up really encouraging them to support their children. Again, this is another phenomenon in the United States. My parents always told me, we hear this all the time, they told me I could do anything. I could be anything. Well, you want that not to be, again, diverted as soon as you stop in school. Mm-hmm. And so I think it really starts with helping families be advocates for their kids and trusting them. And we tend still not to do that. We tend not to take parents' insights as a way that we start from.
Yeah, that's true, because there's a lot of...
You were lucky.
Yeah.
You had parents that, from how you've described it, your parents had the courage to say, hell no, we're not going to do this, we're not going to do that. But I got to tell you, for every one set of your parents, there are 5,000 sets.
Oh, yeah.
They're like, the teacher told me to do this, principal told me to do it, medical doctor told me to do it. Yeah, they're the expert. I'm kind of,
Right.
And
they know my kid.
They know my kid, but no, they really don't. But
it's
again,
scary.
but to be fair to them also, it's building alliances, right? So I also see it on the other side of the tracks from teachers, which are, does everything have to be a fight? And so now you have on the other side of it, you have parents coming in and saying things to teachers that, again, are very adversarial. Why did you do this to my kid? Why did you do that? So again, there has to be a mutual respect for parents and caregivers and teachers to work together for kids. And still we have a very dichotomous, very adversarial position, and we're going to have to undo some of that too for kids to have better outcomes.
Yeah. I was very lucky. I mean, my mom, I can't thank her enough for all she did. She sat there time and time again with homework. My two brothers would help me with reading. My mom was the advocate, Tasmanian devil, didn't give 1 inch. Yeah. But then my dad was like the quiet, when he did speak, it was like, oh boy, bro, he's calling a parent-teacher conference. Oh God, poop's gonna hit the fan. Dad's coming. But that's where, like you said, 1 out of 100,000. Yeah. God knows what the number is.
And again, who helps those tens of thousands of parents? That's the challenge. Who's in their corner, who's helping them get through that.
But it's also a stigma. That parent with that stigma of, my God, my son or daughter is in special ed, or they're going to be stupid. They're not going to be able to read. If they don't read, they can't do this. They can't do that. And it's terrifying. I don't know if I would have handled it as well if I hadn't have dyslexia with my son, but I knew what he was going to be in for.
Right.
Because the other two, no problem.
Right.
Read and write, no trouble. With Malcolm, I remember just sitting him down going, hey, listen, bud, it's going to be fine. You're just going to have to practice a little harder. You're going to work a little smarter. But this is not in any way going to shackle you to where you're going to be just a fool.
Right.
The kid reads all the time now.
I would tell you the secret for me really is, and it sounds like you're doing this with your son, you really want him to be his own learning advocate. Because if he can do that, he'll take that with him for the rest of his life.
Right.
And that's hard. It's hard to be in spaces where you have to advocate for yourself, but it is a skill that's necessary, and it will serve you well. It'll serve you well in school. It'll serve you well in life. It'll serve you well in jobs. You need to be in a space where you're respectful. You're trying to work with people collaboratively, but at the same time, you can say what you need. And by not doing that, you often find yourself in spaces where, again, you blame the victim. That person then gets into all kinds of trouble, and it's a problem. So we used to teach that explicitly, and then work that through with students so they could come to that place. And then we saw them thrive. I could always tell the students that really were having difficulty with that and they couldn't transcend it was going to be hard for them, because then you're letting all these other stereotypes come out, and people then are doing things without correction, and all you're doing is saying, I learn best by having this. Right. So
I can't thank you enough for taking the time. I can't thank you enough for teaching teachers. You don't realize how special that is. I mean, you're like, that's Santa Claus level kind of special, because we need great teachers.
It's true.
And without them, the world flounders. We're just village idiots. Having someone like you who gave their career, I'm sure you could have been an astronaut if you wanted to, to help others learn and teach. That's a special place, Mike. You've got a lot of parents that don't know your name but are thankful for you.
I appreciate that. And I will tell you that any way that I can support families and students, this for me is the reason for being. And I think the strength of a country, you've heard me mention this before, but I love what South Korea says about teachers. They call them nation builders. And really, I think in our country, we have to get to that place that teachers are seen as nation builders, because I am worried that less and less that people see a cultural appreciation for it. And I will tell you, I agree with you. The wealth of this country goes to a place of how strong is your public education system. And if it's not strong, I shudder to think about where the country goes. But it means you have to have support for them. They need to come in. And I want to end where you shared. You have to really value families and parents. Stop thinking of them as the enemy. Stop thinking of them as the people you have to fight with. It's more of open your arms and welcome them. Understand their expertise, understand they know their kids, understand that we're not going to get there holistically unless you're building those bridges. And I think we still have we have a little way to go on that front. So thank you. I really enjoyed it. Anytime you want me back to talk about, we covered a lot of subjects, and any one of those can go a little deeper on that front, and happy to participate.
Well, we could do a whole thing on Philly sports.
That's a whole other thing, and I can connect that with the underdog. There's probably a facet of that also. So thank you.
How are the Phillies going to do this year?
Oh, they're going to win the whole World Series.
That whole thing.
Oh, I guarantee it. Absolutely.
You heard it here.
Yeah, you heard it here. It's right.
Dr. Michael Spagna, you're the best. I can't thank you enough.
Well, thank you. Really enjoyable talking to you today, and thank you.
We'll do it again.
Okay.
All right. Thank you for listening to my conversation with Dr. Spagna. If you enjoyed this episode, please click and hit the like button. Become a subscriber to the podcast. Remember, you can follow the Just a Good Conversation podcast on Instagram, and you can find all the past shows on the website at justagoodconversation.com. Thank you for listening.